Some secrets don't just hide, they wait, buried deep under layers of dirt and denial. They bide their time until someone finally digs deep enough to disturb them. On a lonely stretch of land outside Manito, Wyoming, that day finally came. For years, Dale Wayne Eaton's property sat quiet, unremarkable, a patch of windswept isolation fenced in by rusted wire and paranoia. The locals knew him as a recluse, a man who kept to himself, who didn't take kindly to trespassers. But underneath the sagebrush and the gravel, his land held something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. In the summer of 2002, investigators began to dig, literally. Armed with ground-penetrating radar, forensic teams, and a growing list of suspicions, they started turning over the soil of Eaton's property. What they unearthed would rewrite the story of Lisa Marie Kimmell's disappearance and force everyone to confront just how long justice can take when evil buries itself into the earth. This wasn't a random crime. It wasn't an impulsive act of violence. The clues found on Eaton's land told a story of planning, control, and cruelty. The kind of story only a true predator could craft. One who built his own world on the edge of society, and one who believed that isolation would protect him. The excavation revealed Lisa's car, the black Honda CRX she'd been driving when she vanished, buried 6 feet below the ground, encased in dirt and secrecy. Eaton had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide it, using heavy equipment and precision that hinted at both familiarity with machinery and the cold patience of someone who'd done this before. Forensic investigators described the site like walking into a tomb, a place where time itself seemed to hold its breath. But the dig was only the beginning. What followed were months of forensic analysis, soil samples, trace evidence, and the reconstruction of a timeline that stretched far beyond the night Lisa disappeared. Eaton's property became a map of his mind, cluttered with broken vehicles, makeshift shelters, and survivalist stockpiles. He lived like a man preparing for war, but the battle he was fighting was one of his own making. Eaton's violent tendencies weren't new. He had a record that whispered of rage and control, of moments where his temper broke through whatever thin restraint he still possessed. But what investigators found on his land hinted at something darker, signs that Lisa may not have been the only victim, that Eaton's secret graveyard might have held more than one story. For the detectives who reopened the case, this wasn't just a forensic mission. It was a reckoning. They were piecing together the life of a man who'd built his own prison in plain sight, surrounded by relics of his cruelty. Interviews from those investigators reveal not just the science of the search, but the haunting weight of standing over the disturbed ground, knowing it was the place where a young woman's life ended and a monster's arrogance began to crumble. When we talk about cases like Lisa's, it's easy to focus on the moment of discovery, the crime scene, the evidence, the courtroom. But this episode is about something deeper. What it means to peel back the layers of a killer's world, to see how he lived, what he built, and what he buried. It's about the quiet persistence of truth and the people who refuse to stop digging. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from confusion. It comes from the earth itself, when it finally decides it's had enough of keeping secrets. This is Rocky Mountain Reckoning, the secret graveyard. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hi, John. It is good. How are you?
I'm good. It's Halloween. It won't be when we post this, but it is Halloween officially today.
It is Halloween.
So it's one of your favorite holidays ever.
It is. And I When we leave here, we'll be going home to watch creepy shit all by myself.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that kind of sounds exciting.
To some. To others are like, no, I don't want it.
Sounds pretty exciting
I
to
want
me.
it. So
Oh,
that's
yeah.
what's happening.
Nice. All right, so you ready to dive into this next part of Lisa's story?
Your favorite guy.
Yeah, this piece of shit.
That's I have actually been told you have not been saying asshat enough lately.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This asshat.
Yeah, you got to meet your quota, dude.
I do. I got to do better.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll work that in.
Okay.
So, beneath a patch of Wyoming's earth, the truth was waiting, silent, cold, and patient. For years, Dale Wayne Eaton's land outside Manita looked like any other stretch of rural isolation. But when investigators broke ground, what they unearthed transformed that quiet property into a crime scene that would rewrite the history of one of the state's most haunting disappearances. This was no accident, no impulsive act of rage. What lay beneath the soil revealed intent, planning, control, and a level of cruelty that mirrored the desolation around him. This is Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning, the series where we return to the crimes rooted deep in the dirt and the snow of the American West, the ones that never left the hearts of the people who lived through them.
We investigate the stories buried under snowfall, prairie dust, and decades of unanswered questions. The ones whispered through dry creek beds, across the high plains, and beneath the weight of history itself.
Tonight, we return to Eaton's property, to the excavation that exposed his lies, the forensic discoveries that brought Lisa Marie Kimmell home, and the investigators who refused to stop digging until the truth surfaced. Eaton lived like a ghost among his own ruins, part hermit, part hunter, and entirely consumed by his need for control. But control only lasts as long as the ground stays still. When the dirt started to move, so did the truth. I'm your host, John.
And I'm your co-host, Angela. And just to remind our wonderful listeners, if you like what we do and how we do it, give us a like and a follow. If you're listening on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit that bell.
That's right. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, or wherever you stream your podcasts, rate the show and leave us a review. It helps the show so much. Now, let's get to the story. So sometimes justice doesn't kick down the door. It slips quietly through a lab at the end of a cotton swab, inside a file marked for storage and nearly forgotten. A single cheek swab from an old firearms case, cataloged and ignored, became the whisper that broke a 14-year silence. In 2002, the DNA found its match. It spoke Lisa Marie Kimmell's name once more, and it carried another name with it. Dale the Asshat Eaton.
Thank you.
A loner with a violent streak, a man who drifted through the harsh stretches outside Manita, Wyoming, living off the grid and off the radar. Survivalist instincts ran deep in him. So did paranoia, the kind that builds fences not to keep others out, but to keep his secrets in. But a match in a database wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a map that led straight into the heart of Wyoming's emptiness, to a patch of land that looked as ordinary as any other. No one realized that on that quiet property lay the evidence that would unravel everything, the truth buried deep beneath the same ground Eaton called home. It wasn't the kind of place people stumbled across. You had to know where to look. And finally, in 2002, someone did. That's where our story turns. Under those wide Wyoming skies, investigators arrived with shovels, search warrants, and a kind of hope that has been missing for more than a decade. They didn't know exactly what they'd find, but they knew this: somewhere beneath that soil, justice was waiting. Morning came quiet over Manita, just the way this part of Wyoming likes to keep its secrets. The light stretched low across the hills, washing Eaton's property in a pale, colorless dawn. To most people driving by, it was nothing more than another forgotten patch of dirt, junk, rust, and silence. But for the investigators pulling up that morning, it was something else entirely. They didn't see emptiness. They saw a map, a crime scene waiting to be uncovered. Search teams from Fremont County, the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation, and the FBI began to arrive in slow procession, vehicles kicking up clouds of dust as they rolled to a stop along the worn fence line. A command tent went up near the gate. Evidence markers and equipment cases were stacked in neat rows where the chaos of Eaton's land began. Every investigator knew what this day could bring and what it might not. After 14 years, the odds weren't kind. The desert doesn't forgive easily, and it rarely gives back what's been taken. Still, they came prepared to listen, to the ground, to the wind, to anything that might whisper the truth. Because on that lonely patch of Wyoming's earth, they weren't just digging for evidence. They were digging for Lisa. When Dale Wayne Eaton's DNA linked him to the murder of Lisa Marie Kimmell, investigators knew the breakthrough wasn't just about the man. It was about the land that he called home. His property outside Moneta, Wyoming, 75 miles northwest of Casper, had always drawn quiet suspicion. A scatter of old vehicles, makeshift sheds, and an air of hostility surrounded it. For years, neighbors knew better than to wander too close. But now, that remote stretch of dirt was no longer a curiosity. It was the center of a homicide investigation. Detectives began to dissect Eaton's past, tracing his movements and his habits, piecing together the life he built in isolation. What stood out wasn't only how he lived, but where. The property sat near the same corridor Lisa had driven in March of 1988, a lonely route that twisted through open plains and empty distance. For a man like Eaton, it was the perfect hunting ground. The first true lead didn't come from a file or a database. It came from the people who'd lived nearby. Neighbors who for years had carried memories that never sat right. One of them, known for keeping a detailed daily journal, had documented something strange back in 1988, around the very time that Lisa had vanished. He wrote about Eaton digging, not a post hole, not a trench, a massive pit. He watched as Eaton spent days out there methodically shoveling, sometimes using heavy equipment, sometimes just a pickaxe. The entry described the hole as deep enough to swallow a car. When questioned years later, Eaton dismissed it, said he was putting in a septic tank. But his explanation didn't match the timeline or the memory of the man who'd seen him out there, sweating through the cold spring air, carving out an 8-foot cavity in the earth. These weren't idle stories passed between fence lines. They were detailed recollections, grounded in written proof, a diary entry timestamped to the week Lisa disappeared. Combined with Eaton's solitary nature and his violent history, those statements became more suspicion. They become probable cause. Armed with the DNA match and the neighbor's testimony, law enforcement secured search warrants. It was time to test the ground itself. Multi-agency teams converged on the Moneta property, led by state investigators and assisted by the FBI. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and excavators capable of cutting deep into the compact Wyoming soil. Every vibration of machinery felt like it might wake something long buried. As the first passes of radar swept over the property, the readings returned irregularities, shapes where the ground should have been uniform, voids that hinted at disturbance. The search teams marked those anomalies, one by one, across the dry expanse of Eaton's land. What they didn't yet know was that beneath the barren stretch lay the most important piece of evidence they'd ever find, the proof that would put Lisa Marie Kimmell's killer in prison and the silence of a 14-year mystery to an end. When investigators arrived at Dale Wayne Eaton's property outside Moneta, they were met with silence and the kind of desolation that speaks louder than words. The land stretched out flat and lifeless, a patch of Wyoming dirt battered by years of wind and neglect. It looked less like a home and more like a graveyard of forgotten things. Rusting machinery leaned into the earth, surrounded by piles of scrap metal and twisted engines left to decay. Old oil drums, dented fenders, and splintered tools were scattered across the property, forming a kind of wasteland that mirrored the man who owned it. There was no pattern, no order, just evidence of years spent scavenging, hoarding, and retreating further from the world. At the center of that chaos stood an old converted school bus, the place Eaton called home. Its yellow paint was long faded to a dull brown, and the windows were cracked, some sealed with layers of tape and cardboard. The body sagged slightly on its frame, its tires deflated, its door wedged open by a crowbar. This wasn't shelter. It was survival. Inside the scene was worse. Investigators found trash covering the floor, food wrappers mixed with rotting scraps, and soiled bedding shoved into corners. The air was thick with decay and stale grease. The small space offered no sense of separation. Eaton had slept, cooked, and existed all within a few square feet of filth. Every surface carried the grime of years without care. Outside the school bus, narrow trails snaked through the heaps of debris, paths worn by routine but without direction. Discarded tires, rusted pipes, and makeshift fencing pieced together from warped wood and sheet metal created a maze of clutter. Investigators described it as a junkyard turned inward, the landscape of a mind unraveling under isolation. Sheds and trailers dotted the property, their interiors packed with more refuse. Old tools, engine parts, and broken appliances piled floor to ceiling. There was no organization, no sense of value in what was kept. It was hoarding without purpose, possession without reason. Even the earth itself bore the marks of his neglect. Overgrown in some areas, trampled flat in others, with animal tracks weaving through the dirt. Eaton had lived like this for years, feral, detached, and unreachable. He'd become a fixture of the landscape, a man surrounded by ruin, sustained by hostility, and invisible by choice. His life wasn't built on comfort or community, but on distance. And yet, within that wasteland, investigators sensed something else, an unease beneath the dirt. It wasn't just the junk or the stench that unsettled them. It was the feeling that this land had absorbed something far darker than just neglect. Every step they took, every corner they searched, carried the same unspoken question. What was he trying to bury out here? The answer would come soon enough. The dig began not with a hunch, but with a pattern, a convergence of details that all pointed to one place. After Dale Wayne Eaton's DNA linked him to the murder of Lisa Marie Kimmell, detectives didn't just follow the silence, they followed memory. In Manita, memory runs deep. The neighbors who'd lived near Eaton in 1988 hadn't forgotten what they'd seen, a man spending days on the end carving a massive hole into the earth. Not a ditch, not a trench, something deliberate and something large. They came equipped not just with hope, but with technology. Ground-penetrating radar swept slowly across the surface, tracing waves through the subsurface layers. Cadaver dogs worked methodically, circling flagged areas while investigators mapped anomalies with fluorescent markers. Each reading revealed irregularities, shifts in density, voids where compacted dirt should have been solid. And then came the digging. Shovels first, careful and deliberate. Then the low roar of machinery, backhoes and loaders breaking through the hardened crust of time. The sound changed everything. A hollow clink, sharp and unmistakable. The rhythm of digging stopped. Investigators knelt, brushed away the soil, and saw the glint of steel emerging beneath 6 feet of compacted dirt. Slowly, layer by layer, the outline of a vehicle began to take shape. It was black, compact, still sealed tight by the weight of years. And when the rear came into view, there it was, the license plate that had haunted Wyoming for more than a decade. LIL MISS, Lisa's car. The Honda CRX was buried intact but battered, its body pressed inward by the pressure of earth. Inside, investigators found the fragments of a life abruptly halted, strands of hair, traces of blood, personal effects that hadn't seen light since 1988. Forensic teams documented every inch, photographing, bagging, cataloging. This wasn't just a discovery, it was confirmation. Every element, the neighbor's diary, the disturbed soil, the radar anomalies, all converged to reveal what Eaton had tried to erase. The property's chaos had hidden the truth for 14 years, but in the end, the ground gave it back. The meticulous excavation turned suspicion into evidence and silence into proof. Eaton's secret graveyard had spoken. When the excavation ended, the real work began. The Manita property, once just a scatter of junk and silence, transformed into a full-scale crime scene. Investigators didn't just find a car, they found a story written in steel, blood, and dirt. The first and most damning discovery sat 6 feet underground. Lisa Marie Kimmell's black 1988 Honda CRX SI, the one that had vanished along with her 14 years earlier. It was still marked with her vanity plate LIL MISS, as unmistakable as the day she drove it off the lot. The car was intact but crushed under the weight of years, its windows shattered, its frame bent from the force of burial. Inside, time had preserved what Eaton never meant anyone else to see. Blood, hair, and fibers belonging to Lisa were found throughout the interior, illuminated by luminol in a cold blue glow. Each droplet, each strand told the same truth. She had fought, she had bled, and she had been inside that car when it became her tomb. Among the debris inside, investigators recovered personal items believed to have been Lisa's, pieces of clothing, a pair of teddy bears, and scattered belongings that spoke to who she was before she vanished. They weren't just evidence, they were fragments of a life stolen mid-journey. Nearby, they found the tools Eaton used to hide it all. Shovels, digging bars, and heavy excavation equipment consistent with the kind neighbors had seen him operating back in 1988. Every handle bore his wear, every blade the same soil embedded deep into the metal. Elsewhere on the property, investigators uncovered a hammer and several knives. Forensic testing later showed they couldn't be definitively matched to Lisa's wounds, but their presence, combined with Eaton's violent history, fit the pattern too well to ignore. They became pieces in a puzzle that was almost complete. Then came the bus. Inside, the walls told their own story. Investigators found restraint points, strands of hair, and fibers later confirmed to be Lisa's. Cleaning agents, bleach, ammonia, solvents were found nearby, suggesting a hasty attempt to scrub away evidence. The air still carried the acrid tang of chemicals and rust. Some things were missing: Lisa's keys, her purse, items that would have traveled with her. Investigators believed Eaton had destroyed or discarded them, erasing the last traces of what connected her to the outside world. Even the earth itself offered testimony. Soil samples surrounding the buried car showed layering consistent with excavation from the spring of 1988, matching the season neighbors remembered him digging. The timing was no longer guesswork, it was science. And then there was something far more personal. A letter. Years before the excavation in 1988, someone had left a cruel, mocking letter at Lisa's gravesite, a letter signed Stringfellow Hawk, referencing the hero of a television show. For years, no one knew who wrote it, but handwriting analysis revisited after Eaton's arrest matched the taunting scrawl to him. It wasn't just a letter. It was arrogance on paper, proof of a killer still circling his own crime. Taken together, the evidence told a single, unbroken story. Eaton abducted Lisa, he killed her, he buried her car and every trace of her beneath his own land, believing distance and desolation would do the rest. But in the end, the same ground that sheltered his secrets gave him away. When the digging stopped, the science began. What had been a field of dust and ruin became a grid of numbered evidence bags, each one holding a fragment of truth the Earth had tried to keep. Inside the state crime lab, the quiet was different, controlled, clinical. Every breath of wind and noise from the Manita Plains was replaced by the steady rhythm of machines. Technicians in white coats hovered over microscopes, pipettes, and cameras, piecing together a story molecule by molecule. The investigators had spent days under the Wyoming sun, now stood behind glass, watching as the dirt-streaked artifacts from Eaton's property transformed into data points, DNA, blood spatter, trace fibers, all under the sterile light instead of sky. This was the other side of the reckoning, the part where emotion gives way to evidence, where every speck of soil, every stain, every fiber has a voice, and the truth is no longer hidden in the wind, but under a microscope. And it was here, in the hum of machines and the silence between results, that the full weight of what Eaton had done began to take shape. The investigation didn't end in Manita, it just moved indoors. The soil, the metal, the blood, all of it was boxed, labeled, and shipped to labs where silence gives way to science. Over weeks, months, and years, the pieces began to align. What the desert had hidden, the microscopes made undeniable. The first and most powerful revelation came from DNA. Forensic specialists re-examined the seminal fluid collected during Lisa's autopsy in 1988, samples that had waited nearly 14 years for technology to catch up. Using short tandem repeat DNA profiling, they compared those samples to Dale Wayne Eaton's genetic profile from a 1998 conviction. 13 alleles aligned perfectly, and identification so precise, the odds of error were 1 in 6.2 quintillion. That number wasn't just proof, it was the scientific equivalent of a fingerprint burned into history. Eaton's DNA told the story he never would. That he was the man who'd abducted, assaulted, and murdered Lisa Marie Kimmell. Inside the unearthed Honda CRX, forensic teams found what remained of the struggle. Luminol revealed patterns invisible to the naked eye, splashes and stains lighting up like constellations across the car's interior. Blood, hair, and fibers, all traced back to Lisa through mitochondrial DNA analysis and serological testing. Even the smallest fibers told the same truth. The same materials found on Lisa's clothing were embedded in the car and inside the nearby bus on Eaton's property. It was proof that she'd been held captive there before being killed. The CRX itself became a crime scene frozen in time. Its body bore impact marks, its windows shattered inward, its metal corroded with age but still recognizable. Technicians searched for fingerprints, touch DNA, and blood spatter patterns. The results revealed a hurried attempt at cleanup. Eaton had wiped, scrubbed, and rinsed, but not well enough. The earth had preserved what he couldn't erase. Among the recovered personal items were Lisa's teddy bears and clothing, small, haunting artifacts confirmed by her family. They were tokens of who she was before she vanished, and their presence in that buried car was as damning as any laboratory result. On the property itself, investigators tested every tool Eaton might have used. The shovels and the digging equipment matched perfectly with the excavation depth and the soil composition around the buried car. The hammer and knives recovered nearby were swabbed for DNA. The results were inconclusive. Their relevance was clear. They fit the same pattern of violence documented in Lisa's autopsy: blunt force trauma followed by stabbing. Inside the bus, the story turned darker. Investigators found restraint marks, deep indentations in wood, fibers embedded in grooves, and cleaning agents lined up on a shelf. Bleach, ammonia, solvents, all tools of erasure. But the fibers and hair found there betrayed him once again. They matched Lisa. She had been there, alive and terrified. Piece by piece, the evidence became more than proof. It became a portrait, not just of what Eaton did, but of who he was: methodical, isolated, devoid of empathy, a predator who thought distance and dirt could bury the truth. But science doesn't forget, and when it finally spoke, its voice was absolute. Turning Dale Wayne Eaton's desolate Manita property into a courtroom case was a feat of discipline and endurance. What began as chaos, rusted junk, scorched dirt, fragments of a buried life, was translated piece by piece into a prosecution file that would stand unbreakable under the law. It started with documentation. Every artifact recovered from that property, from soil samples to the LIL MISS license plate, was logged, sworn, and sealed. Affidavits accompanied every object, every photo, every chain of custody form. Investigators operated like surgeons, tracing each hand that touched a single piece of evidence. Nothing moved without a signature. Nothing entered the record without proof of where it came from and how it was handled. That precision wasn't just procedure, it was protection. They knew the defense would challenge every inch of the investigation, so they left nothing to chance. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, investigators and prosecutors began reconstructing the story Lisa herself could no longer tell. They layered forensic data over witness accounts, phone records, and travel timelines, creating a composite of her final hours. Each step in that reconstruction brought them closer to proving what happened and who made it happen. The effort became a collaboration on a scale rarely seen in Wyoming. The Natrona County District Attorney's Office steered the legal course, while the FBI's Forensic Division verified DNA matches and validated testing protocols. The Wyoming State Crime Lab handled the science, the blood, the hair, the fibers, and the DA's team translated that science into narrative, evidence that could speak in a courtroom. Then came the hardest decision of all, the question of punishment. In early strategy sessions, prosecutors reviewed aggravating factors: Eaton's prior violent offenses, sexual assault, the deliberate concealment of the crime, and the handwritten Stringfellow Hawk letter mocking investigators and Lisa's family. It wasn't just murder, it was premeditation layered with cruelty. When they finished reviewing the evidence, the conclusion was unanimous. The state would seek the death penalty. The prosecution also took a bold step, a decision that would shape the trial itself. They introduced another crime, the 1997 Breeden kidnapping attempt. Eaton had tried to lure the family on an isolated road, armed and offering fake help. The parallels to Lisa's abduction were chilling. Despite fierce objections from the defense, the judge would allow it. The Breeden case, prosecutors argued, revealed the pattern behind Eaton's violence: predatory, practiced, and deliberate. Every document, every exhibit, every diagram became part of an overwhelming story. What had begun as fragments of dirt and metal now formed a structure of proof so airtight it could hold under any cross-examination. By the time the file was complete, the evidence from a forgotten field in Manita had evolved into a case ready for trial, a case built from dust, discipline, and the unrelenting will to see justice finally stand in the light. When Dale Wayne Eaton was formally charged with the murder of Lisa Marie Kimmell, the defense wasted no time. Their strategy wasn't to deny the evidence, it was to reshape the man at the center of it. Eaton was assigned a public defender, and almost immediately, the team began rewriting his story. They moved away from the portrait of a violent loner and towards something different, something broken. They painted him not as a calculating predator, but as a damaged man living at the ragged edge of sanity, a survivor of trauma, a recluse driven by paranoia and mental illness. In the courtroom filings that followed, the defense challenged nearly every piece of physical and circumstantial evidence that the state had gathered. They claimed the excavation of Eaton's Manita property was unlawful, arguing that search warrants lacked sufficient probable cause. Motions sought to exclude evidence obtained from the dig, along with witness testimony. forensic analysis, and even photographs from the site. And they fought hard to suppress any mention of Eaton's prior behavior, the 1997 Breeden kidnapping attempt, his violent history, and the whispers of other assaults. To the defense, those acts were prejudicial distractions, irrelevant to the charge of Lisa's murder, but to the prosecution, they were the pattern that revealed intent. At the same time, the defense turned inward into Eaton's mind. They commissioned psychiatric evaluations, conducting interviews inside the prison, and compiling reports that would later become the foundation of their case. Psychiatrists described Eaton as deeply paranoid, possibly delusional. He was restless, distrustful, emotionally detached. They wrote of a man who heard threats in every silence, saw betrayal in every face, and lived in a world where fear had calcified into rage. Those reports didn't absolve him, but they offered something the defense could use: mitigation. The idea that Eaton wasn't evil by design, but damaged by nature. Not a monster, but a man whose mind had fractured under the weight of his own isolation. It was a fragile argument, but it was the only one that they had. Each motion, each filing, each psychiatric report built toward a single goal: to humanize this freaking total asshat just enough to keep him alive. They weren't fighting for freedom. They were fighting against death. While prosecutors built their case and the defense fought to fracture it, another kind of strength was forming far from the courtroom. It didn't come from a badge, a lab report, or a legal filing. It came from a family that refused to let Lisa's name fade into the background of a cold case file. For 14 years, the Kimmells had lived with questions that never stopped echoing. Every headline, every rumor, every dead lead had left a scar. But when the truth finally surfaced, they didn't retreat into grief. They turned it into purpose. In the months following Eaton's arrest, Lisa's family, led by her mother, Sheila Kimmell, became the steady heartbeat of the case. They attended every hearing, spoke with investigators, and stood before cameras with quiet grace. Sheila became a symbol of unwavering advocacy, channeling heartbreak into resolve. She wasn't just speaking for Lisa, she was speaking for every family still waiting for answers. As the legal machine returned, the Kimmells carried the story in a way no one else could. They brought humanity back to the evidence. They reminded the world that this case wasn't only about crime scenes and DNA. It was about a daughter who laughed, loved, and never made it home. The law would decide Eaton's fate, but the Kimmells had already decided something far greater: that Lisa's voice would never be silenced again. For Sheila Kimmell, grief never stood still. It evolved, reshaped by time, tempered by pain, and transformed into purpose. In the years after Lisa's murder, she became more than a mother seeking answers. She became an advocate, a voice for every family still waiting for justice in the cold shadows of unsolved cases. She joined victims' rights groups, spoke at conferences, and lobbied for reform. She pushed for laws that would protect evidence, reopen dormant files, and gave families a seat at the investigative table. Every speech, every interview, every letter was rooted in one unshakable truth: that Lisa's story still mattered. Sheila organized annual remembrance events, small ceremonies that grew each year as the community gathered beneath the banners that led Justice for LIL MISS. Those vigils weren't about vengeance. They were about remembrance, about making sure Lisa's name would never be swallowed by silence again. When the case against Eaton moved toward trial, the Kimmells became fixtures in the courtroom. They attended nearly every hearing, front row, side by side, a family that had carried loss longer than most could even imagine. Their presence carried weight. Investigators noticed, reporters wrote about it, and those in the gallery could feel it. The gravity that came from the 15 years of waiting for a face to match to the nightmare. It wasn't easy. Counselors and victim support specialists helped prepare them for what was coming. The photos, the testimony, the confrontation with the man accused of killing their daughter. Still, they showed up, composed, steady, and unflinching. Sheila sat quietly, her expression unreadable but resolute, the kind of calm that comes only from walking through fire and refusing to burn. In Casper and across Wyoming, the emotion spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Communities that had followed Lisa's disappearance in 1988 were now drawn back into the story, older, warier, but still watching. Vigils lit the courthouse lawn. Town halls filled with citizens demanding justice, not just for Lisa, but for every woman who had vanished into the rural expanse of the West. The headlines called it a reckoning. The air, one reporter wrote, felt heavy with expectation. For the Kimmells, it was simpler than that. This wasn't about headlines or history. It was about finally standing in the same room as the asshat who had taken everything from them and not looking away. As the case against Dale Wayne Eaton moved from investigation to courtroom, the tone shifted. What had been years of silence and search became a sequence of hearings, each one another small battle in the long war for justice. The pretrial proceedings unfolded with tension and precision, a careful choreography of law, evidence, and strategy. The first major decision came swiftly: bond denied. Given the brutality of the crime, the risk of flight, and Eaton's violent history, the court wasn't willing to take chances. He would remain in custody, where the echoes of his own past closed in tighter every day. From there, the process accelerated. A volley of motions from both sides flooded the docket, each one a contest over what could and couldn't be seen by the jury. The defense demanded full access to every lab report, every interview, every photograph taken at the Manita property. The prosecution countered, determined to protect the integrity of the evidence chain they had built with such care. The judge, balancing law and logic, made rulings that would define the coming trial. Despite fierce defense objections, the court ruled that the evidence from Eaton's property and the DNA match through CODIS were admissible. The reasoning was clear, the science was sound, the procedure airtight, and the precedent well established. In that moment, the weight of modern forensics officially entered Wyoming's legal record. DNA had become not just evidence, but authority. With the evidence locked in, attention turned to what came next: jury selection. In a case like this, that was not simple. The entire state knew Lisa's name. Her story had haunted Casper for more than a decade, and the community's empathy ran deep. Both sides argued the same concern. Could 12 people from Natrona County truly judge the case without the burden of memory or emotion? Surveys were conducted, panels pre-screened, and discussions of venue change hovered over every hearing. But moving the trial would mean moving the heart of it, and for the Kimmells and for Wyoming. This was a story rooted in home soil. Each pretrial hearing brought the inevitable closer. The legal walls had closed around Eaton. The evidence was in, the rules set, and the stage prepared. What remained was the reckoning itself. The trial was coming, and for the first time in 15 years, Lisa Marie Kimmell's story would be told in full view of the world. As the trial of Dale Wayne Eaton drew nearer, the atmosphere tightened, like a wire pulled taut across every corner of Casper. Investigators, attorneys, journalists, and the family all felt the same gravity pressing in. After nearly 15 years, justice was no longer a concept. It was a date on the calendar. In custody, Eaton's behavior became increasingly erratic. Some days he withdrew completely, sitting motionless in his cell for hours, refusing to speak or even respond. Other days, he filled pages with rambling letters, angry, paranoid, shifting between claims of innocence and hostility toward anyone who dared to read them. Prison staff and mental health evaluators described him as unpredictable, emotionally flat one moment, agitated the next. The defense used these observations to fortify their case for diminished capacity. A man detached from reality rather than a cold-blooded killer. Outside the prison walls, the media storm began to swell. Press conferences multiplied as prosecutors, law enforcement, and family representatives delivered updates in steady rhythm. Television specialists revisited the case, retelling Lisa's story with archival footage, the haunting image of her smile, and that unmistakable license plate, LIL MISS. Her face returned everywhere, on the evening news, in the newspaper columns, across social media. Candlelight vigils flickered at courthouse lawns. For Mitty in Wyoming, it felt as if the past had come alive again, asking to be heard. Inside the Natrona County offices, investigators worked late into the night. They rebuilt timelines, prepared exhibits, and checked every chain of custody log one final time. For them, this was the end of a mission that had consumed careers. They'd waited years for their evidence to have its day in court. Across town, the Kimmell family was doing their own preparation, writing and rewriting their victim impact statements. Sheila Kimmell combed through old letters, diaries, and photographs, searching for words that could capture what Lisa's absence had done to them. For her, it wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledgement, about ensuring the jury saw Lisa not as a name in a file, but as a daughter, a friend, and a light stolen far too soon. As the days ticked down, Casper seemed to hold its breath. Reporters called it anticipation. The locals called it reckoning. In living rooms, classrooms, and coffee shops, people spoke Lisa's name again. They remembered where they were when she vanished, and now where they'd been when the trial began. The science had spoken. The earth had given up its secrets. Now it was time for the law to do the same. 15 years after Lisa Marie Kimmell vanished into the Wyoming night, her story was finally coming home, not to rest, but to testify. Casper in winter carries a kind of silence that doesn't comfort. It lingers. The cold presses in against the windows of old buildings, the air sharp with the scent of snow and memory. The courthouse, its limestone face worn by decades of weather and judgment, stood ready once again to weigh a story born on Highway 26, the same stretch of road where Lisa's journey had ended in darkness. Inside, the halls were alive with quiet preparation. Papers rustled like whispers. Printers clicked, and the low hum of conversation carried down long marble corridors. Boxes of evidence, once sealed and forgotten, now sat stacked beneath fluorescent lights. The LIL MISS license plate, the recovered soil samples, the photographs of the Manita dig. Each object told a fragment of the same truth, waiting to be spoken aloud. For investigators, this was the moment they'd built toward in silence. The day when the story buried beneath Wyoming dirt would finally be brought into the light of law. The desks where they'd pored over cold case files had given way to witness lists and courtroom seating charts. Every log, every chain of custody entry, every sleepless night would now have its day. Outside, reporters gathered behind barricades, their breaths clouding in the frigid air. News vans lined the street. Cameras trained on the courthouse doors. Microphones waited for the soundbite. A quote, a glance, a headline. Across the plaza, citizens stood bundled in coats, holding signs that read "Justice for LIL MISS." It wasn't spectacle. It was remembrance. 15 years of silence had hardened into resolve. The evidence had spoken. The ground itself had testified, giving up what Eaton tried to hide. Now, the words would come from the living, investigators, witnesses, and a family who had waited too long to be heard. The story that began on Wyoming Highway 26 with a young woman behind the wheel of a black Honda CRX and a heart full of plans was circling back to the place where justice would take its stand. For the Kimmells, The walk to the courthouse wasn't about victory. It was about endurance, the final stretch of a journey no family should ever have to take. And so 15 years later, the story returned home, not buried, not forgotten, but standing tall beneath oath and light. Justice had waited long enough. Now it was time for the law to listen. In the end, justice doesn't always come with sirens or with shouts. Sometimes it rises slowly from the ground, quiet, cold, and undeniable. Beneath the hardpan earth of Manita, Wyoming, a car waited. For 14 years, the black Honda CRX sat buried in silence, its metal bones rusting under the weight of dust and time. And yet, even underground, it kept a secret strong enough to shatter the quiet of an entire state. When investigators pulled LIL MISS from the dirt, they weren't just recovering evidence. They were exhuming a promise, the one they'd made in 1988 when Lisa Marie Kimmell's bright future vanished somewhere along Highway 26. Her story had traveled from riverbanks to file drawers, from rumor to record, from heartbreak to history. And in that moment, with the car unearthed and the truth undeniable, the long echo of her disappearance finally found its reply. Dale Wayne Eaton's land told the story that he'd tried to erase. Every shovel mark, every trace of soil, every strand of evidence whispering the same truth. He built himself a fortress of isolation, a scrapyard kingdom where he believed no one would ever find what he'd done. But in the end, even the desert speaks. What investigators found beneath the barren ground wasn't just a car. It was proof that time doesn't wash everything away, that some stories, especially the ones written in blood and silence, refuse to stay buried. For Lisa's family, that recovery was more than evidence. It was her return, a daughter once lost to darkness, brought back into the light by persistence, science, and love that refused to die. Sheila Kimmell once said that finding Lisa's car felt like hearing her voice again, not a whisper, but a declaration that she had never really been gone. The case that began in the quiet of Wyoming highway was now headed for the courthouse steps in Casper. After years of absence, after decades of questions, justice was no longer an idea. It was a date on the docket and trial on the horizon. The investigation was over, the excavation complete, but the reckoning, the one that would decide what kind of man Dale Wayne Eaton truly was, had only just begun. This was the secret graveyard. Next time, we enter the courtroom, and for the first time, the state of Wyoming will speak for Lisa Marie Kimmell. Lisa Marie Kimmell was more than a name on a file, more than a photograph that time has tried to fade. She was light, fierce, driven, and full of quiet kindness, the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like they mattered. Born in Tennessee and raised beneath Montana's wide open skies, Lisa carried that landscape with her, vast, determined, and unafraid of distance. She was the kind of daughter who called home often, the kind of friend who remembered birthdays, and the kind of young woman who was building something for herself, one shift, one paycheck, 1 mile at a time. She loved teddy bears, road trips, and the freedom that came with the open highway. And it was that same love of movement, that confidence behind the wheel, that carried her out of Denver on March 25, 1988, heading toward Cody, Wyoming. A drive that should have taken 8 hours, a drive that should have ended in a hug, a smile, and another tomorrow. Instead, it became a question that haunted a state for 15 years. Lisa was just 18. She had dreams, plans, a life ready to unfold, and all of it was stolen on a lonely stretch of Highway 26. What happened to Lisa was horrific, but what followed, the years of searching, the fight for justice, revealed something just as powerful as the crime was cruel. Her mother's courage. Sheila Kimmell turned grief into movement, pain into purpose. She became the voice her daughter no longer could be. Relentless, articulate, and unflinching. She stood in courtrooms, spoke at conferences, wrote, remembered, and refused to let Lisa's name be forgotten. Through her, Lisa's story transcended tragedy. It became a testament to endurance, to the kind of love that does not die, even when everything else has. When investigators finally unearthed that black Honda CRX from the hard Wyoming earth, still wearing the LIL MISS license plate, it wasn't just evidence, it was resurrection, proof that truth survives no matter how long it's been buried. Lisa's legacy isn't confined to case files or verdicts. It lives in every mother who refuses to give up, every investigator who keeps digging, every listener who still believes that remembrance is a form of justice. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman who should have made it home. We remember Lisa Marie Kimmell, not for how she was taken, but for how fiercely she lived and how deeply she was loved. And tonight, as we close this chapter, we don't bury her story again. We keep it here, where it belongs, alive, spoken, and carried forward. For Lisa, the road home was stolen, but her story made it there. Lisa Marie Kimmell's story reminds us that the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried. For years, her name echoed quietly across Wyoming's empty roads, whispered in police stations, carried through the wind on Highway 26. But in the end, it wasn't whispers that found her. It was persistence. It was science. It was the love that refused to stop searching.
And tonight, her story stands as proof that justice doesn't fade with time. Every case like Lisa's, every victim who never made it home, deserves the same relentless pursuit, the same light, the same refusal to let silence win.
If you've been moved by Lisa's story or by the work we do here, we invite you to be part of our continuing effort. Follow Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning wherever you listen to your podcasts. Rate, review, and share these stories. It helps others find the truth buried in the dust.
To support our ongoing investigations and advocacy, visit darkdialogue.com or join us on Patreon and Ko-fi. Your contributions help us keep telling the stories that matter, the ones still waiting to be heard.
You can also visit our Adoptive Victim page to help fund case preservation and awareness for families still searching for answers, or sign up for the Dark Dialogue Collective to volunteer your skills for fieldwork, outreach, and boots-on-the-ground investigations.
Because every voice counts, and every effort brings us closer to giving victims the justice they deserve.
For Lisa Marie Kimmell, and for all lives lost to the silence and neglect, we remember, we speak, and we search. This has been Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning,
where we return to the crimes rooted deep in the dirt and snow of the American West.
The ones that never left the hearts of those who lived through them. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep their stories alive, and make the guilty face the reckoning.